The title of this talk is Sources and Approaches for Analyzing Puyo Connections with Goguryeo in Baekje. The theme of this group of studies centers on the question of how a close analysis of material culture may help us to identify and assess networks associated with the ancient state of Puyo, particularly with regard to direct or indirect contacts with polities and peoples on the Korean Peninsula. Prior to the discovery and analysis of the archaeological correlate of Puyo in central Jilin province, studies of Puyo's supposed connections with peninsular polities were necessarily based on sparse references in written records, some of which are grounded in myth or are otherwise unreliable as historical evidence. In recent decades, however, archaeological advances in northeastern China and the Korean Peninsula have provided new sources of data and have facilitated a deeper understanding of Puyo, its culture, and its relations with surrounding regions. Although we are now able to make some initial attempts to address the matter of Puyo's external relations, the present state of the field requires that these be only preliminary explorations. Future archaeological discoveries, we hope, will allow us to rework or to abandon any models that we create today and to achieve greater clarity with time. In this talk, I'll attempt to summarize the nature of the problem, outline the basic set of relevant data, and suggest some methodological approaches that may prove fruitful. At certain points, I will inject my own interpretations and assumptions with the full awareness that others may not share them. And this is a reflection of the preliminary nature of these explorations and an invitation for discussion and debate. And I'll begin with the geographic setting. The state of Puyo formed in the region that is today the central portion of Jilin province in China. Its center was long thought to have been the modern city of Nong'an, but archaeological findings have shown that it was instead located at the city of Jilin on the Songhua River. My own method of estimating the territorial extent of Puyo, which probably fluctuated over time, was to consider regions that are heavily fortified as stress zones, probably marking frontier regions subject to challenge from the outside. And there are 4 such zones marked by the presence of networks of hill forts designed to monitor and defend from external intrusion. Archaeological remains found in the area bounded by these stress zones generally conform to types associated with Puyo, suggesting that this area approximates the territory directly governed by the Puyo state. Now, this method results in a territory lying in the vast region drained by the north-flowing Songhua River, as well as the upper reaches of the Dongliao River, and extending southwestward as far as Fushun in eastern Liaoning. Now, I believe that this area represents the territory of the Puyo state proper at its height, though historical records indicate that Puyo at times exerted aggressive influence over the regions to its east, such as those regions occupied by the Ilo in the 3rd century, and still later records that mention an eastern Puyo that probably existed in the Tumen River basin. Now, we must also consider the nature of the written records available to us. Now, those records that are relevant to the question of Puyo's external relations can be classified in various ways, and we should consider the extent to which each should be viewed as representing history, myth, or hyperbole. Records that can be seen as clearly historical in nature are those found in the Chinese standard histories and related works, but these provide only very sparse information on Puyo. The late 3rd century Sangguo Zhi tells us that Puyo had a king whose power was not beyond challenge, and that the principal regions, the outlying regions of the state, were overseen by elites, indicating an inegalitarian social structure. The Chinese source notes that the Puyo were known for certain products, such as horses, red jade, which is probably carnelian, sables, and other items which we can assume were trade goods, often presented to Chinese courts as tribute. Other records concerning Puyo are found in writings produced by the states of Goguryeo and Baekje. And those attributed to Goguryeo describe Puyo in mythical terms as the place of origin of the Goguryeo founder, while other early records purport to describe successful Goguryeo campaigns against Puyo. I believe that the latter set of records can be classified as hyperbole, probably reflecting actual events, but exaggerating Koguryo's successes against Puyo. The records that are found in Baekje sources make the claim that Baekje elites were descended from Puyo royalty by way of Koguryo, again in the form of a foundation myth. It is important to assess carefully the claims made in the foundation myths. The myth of Koguryo is very clearly based on that of Puyo, and that of Baekje simply builds on the Koguryo myth. All three claim that their ruling houses descended from refugees from states to the north, all attributing those founders with semi-divine origins. Now, claims of external and divine origins for ruling elites is a pattern often found in world mythology, and these are typically understood as entirely mythical in nature, not reflecting historical reality. Although it is possible for a breakaway group from one state to assert control over a non-state population to form a new state-level polity, it's unlikely that such a scenario played out 3 times in succession in nearly identical form in the Korea-Manchuria region. It is much more likely that this scenario represents a mythic archetype that was broadly shared by people in that region as something necessary to the legitimation of a certain type of social structure. The claim that ruling elites came from the outside and were of divine or semi-divine origin served to set those elites apart from the governed masses. The myth, therefore, served as a kind of charter for an inegalitarian social structure in which a hereditary elite governed the masses in a top-down hierarchy. The specific structure of the myth could be adjusted as changing circumstances made necessary, which is quite possibly why we find several different alternate versions of the Koguryo and Baekje foundation myths. In other words, they represent snapshots of the myth at different times and in different circumstances. Because of this, we should be very cautious when treating the claims made in Koguryo and Baekje sources of their having had Puyo origins. It's very possible that there is no historical basis for such claims. We can now discuss at least 2 distinct categories of networks associated with Puyo. The first involves the claims of historical succession from Puyo by means of small-scale migration of elites to form a new state. Although there are strong reasons to resist reading these myths as history, we should not rule out the possibility entirely, and we may explore the question through analysis of the material record. The second category involves networks of trade or diplomacy, which can be expected to be historically realistic and can also be explored through material culture, which I here understand to include artifacts as well as fixed features such as hill forts and other structures like tombs. Unavoidably, discussions of these 2 categories will intertwine at times, and I'll address both of them briefly in a moment. Although it's clear that Puyo engaged with neighboring groups, including Chinese states, in various ways, I'll confine the discussion here to the 2 relevant peninsular polities, Koguryo and Baekje, and I'll address them separately. And we'll begin with the case of Koguryo. Now, as I've already noted, by the 5th century, if not earlier, Koguryo elites claimed that their rulers were descended from a semi-divine refugee from Puyo. The foundation myth describes the circumstances of the founder's birth and flight, though many of the details vary significantly among different versions of the myth. Now, given this variation, and the clear fact that the form of the myth was simply adapted from that of Puyo, the mythic account should not be considered as historically reliable. It's also telling that all of the surviving versions of the foundation myth can be reliably dated to no earlier than the early 5th century, by which time Puyo no longer existed as an independent state, but was instead a dependency of Koguryo. This suggests the possibility that Koguryo's claim to being a successor to Puyo was created only after Puyo had become a dependency of Koguryo, and the political implications of this are obvious. However, the notion that Koguryo had earlier had some close connection with Puyo can be seen in the Sangwo-zhi, which notes that from the perspective of the 3rd century, Koguryo had anciently been considered as a separate race of the Puyo. Now, the term for separate race here is biejong, the meaning of which is difficult to ascertain with precision without some context. But here it seems to indicate a group that formed part of the Puyo polity but which was distinct in what we might today think of as ethnic terms from the people who form the core of Puyo. And note that this is quite different from the claim that Koguryo rulers descended from a refugee of the Puyo royal clan. The same 3rd century Chinese source notes that Koguryo was similar to Puyo in terms of language and certain customs, but they were distinct in other respects, such as their temperament and their dress. Now, from this brief description, we can see that there were 2 different claimed connections between Koguryo and Puyo. An earlier vague association that appears to suggest a political categorization, and a later, more specific claim of succession by way of descent from the Puyo royal family. The material record does not offer us much to work with when attempting to assess connections between Puyo and Koguryo, except that comparisons of surviving remains strongly suggest cultural distinction rather than affinity. Mortuary practice, which is the most readily available and diagnostic index of cultural identity for this particular case, shows only stark contrasts. Puyo tombs employed wooden coffins in earthen pits, whereas Koguryo tombs consisted of stone cairns built with little, if any, excavation of the ground surface. The specifics of funerary practice, to the extent that we can reconstruct them, show also primarily distinctions. Ceramic forms and their modes of manufacture are also different, though regional distinctions can also be observed within political bounds, so ceramics is perhaps not the most useful index for the present analysis. The hill fort that seems to be closely associated with Puyo frontier fortification does not appear in the regions in and around Huanren, which is believed to be the birthplace of Koguryo, though they do appear in the region immediately to the north, and I'll return to this point shortly. There are certain artifacts found within the Huanren region that appear to have been products of Puyo. The beads and earrings that were found in the Wangjianglo Cemetery in Huanren closely resemble some specimens found in the Puyo cemeteries at Laohashen and Shichago. And this has prompted some Chinese scholars to propose that the Wangjianglo tombs belong to the Puyo founders of Koguryo. But this is an argument that I find to be entirely unconvincing, as there are many ways, including trade, that would much more easily explain how such artifacts came to be in the Huanren region. However, these finds do suggest that the Huanren region, at the time of Koguryo's formation as a state, did have access to certain goods produced in Puyo by direct or indirect exchange. Now, I don't think it's presently possible to make more specific claims regarding Puyo's early contacts with Koguryo on the basis of artifact analysis, though a look at the geographic setting and some other types of archaeological remains will allow us to suggest some likely models for explaining early relations between Puyo and Koguryo. Now, it's generally assumed that Koguryo formed in the Huanren region of eastern Liaoning, and this is probably correct, though definitive proof of it is as yet lacking. My analysis of Puyo frontier fortifications suggests that at some early time, Puyo's direct territorial control probably had extended as far as the region of Qingyuan, as numerous hill forts have been found in the hills of that county. Huanren lies roughly 50 kilometers to the south of these hill forts. The Xinbin region, which lies between Qingyuan and Huanren, is a region drained by the Suzi River, which flows to the northwest and merges with the Hun River at Fushun. The Suzi Valley and the adjacent region to the east as far as Tonghua and Jilin is marked archaeologically by the remains of the Han commandery of Xuantu, which was established with its base at Yongling around 75 BCE, in an area later described as to the northwest of Koguryo. Xuantu was very unusual among Han's frontier commanderies, as it consisted of only 3 districts and appears to have functioned as an agency for engaging with indigenous groups to its south, the principal group being Koguryo. The placement of the commandery's districts was such that it obstructed transit between Puyo and the formative Koguryo. And even after a stronger Koguryo forced the commandery to withdraw to the Fushun region in the early 2nd century, Xuantu continued to act as the agent for Koguryo relations with Han, and evidently played a critical role in defending against Koguryo incursions northward against Puyo. The archaeological record of the Xinbin Huanren region is very complex for the time period associated with formative Koguryo, which here we mean the 1st century BCE up to the 2nd century CE. And this is a zone in which several neighboring archaeological cultures are represented, but archaeological research to date is still at the preliminary stage. I've hypothesized that Puyo influence had at some point extended to the Xinbin Huanren region, and the Jolbon Puyo that appears in later historical records may be a reflection of this. Although it's difficult to demonstrate this through archaeological data, it may be significant that 2 specimens of the bronze antenna-style dagger and sword that are associated with Puyo, and here I'm talking about the 1C type, both dated approximately to the early 2nd century BCE, have been discovered at sites south of the zone marked by the Puyo hill forts. The Piaopu site at Banxi is probably associated with groups that were later called the Yangmek, and the Jinqiang site at Tonghua is probably associated with another Mek group that had been absorbed by a growing Koguryo by the 1st century CE. Since the known distribution of Type 1 antenna daggers and swords suggests the existence of a Puyo diplomatic network, with such swords being presented to leaders of allied groups, these Type 1C swords may represent an example of an attempted alliance or even an annexation of the region in which Koguryo later formed. Now, I won't discuss the daggers and swords further here because they're the subject of another talk in this symposium. The logical extension of my hypothesis that I just outlined in very summary terms suggests that Puyo had, probably during the early 2nd century BCE, extended its direct influence southward to the region in which Koguryo later formed. It's possible that the Huanren region under Puyo influence is that later referred to retrospectively as Jolbon Puyo. And this would account for the later memory of Koguryo as having been a biejong of Puyo, a separate stock of Puyo. By the early 1st century BCE, the Koguryo or Mek people in that region represented enough of a threat to Han's Liaodong commandery to the west, and possibly to Puyo as well, that the abolished Xuantu commandery was removed to a new location that effectively cut off the Xinbin Huanren region from Puyo, while its governors engaged with the leaders of those groups to the south, such as Koguryo, in client relationships. The Koguryo state is likely to have been an entirely indigenous formation, but there was clearly a lasting historical memory of close relations with Puyo. If the royal clan of Koguryo really did descend from a Puyo refugee, this need not have been a member of the Puyo royal house, but it could reflect memories of a breaking with Puyo domination of the Huanren or Jolbon region. To summarize the case of Koguryo, I'd emphasize that the claim in the foundation myth of derivation from the Puyo royal house should not be read as historical, especially since such specific claims cannot be shown to date before the time of Puyo's collapse and its subjugation as a dependency under Koguryo by the late 4th century. Instead, it seems much more likely that Puyo's direct influence had extended as far southward as the Xinbin Huanren region as early as the 2nd century BCE, but this influence was effectively severed by 75 BCE with the interposing of the relocated Xuantu commandery. Analysis of the material culture of early Koguryo suggests cultural distinction rather than commonality with Puyo, though it is of course possible that non-material cultural elements that we can't examine today would suggest some shared characteristics, perhaps including language. Finds of Puyo-style artifacts in early Koguryo contexts are intriguing and certainly unsurprising, but at the present time, there is nothing that I know of to suggest anything other than exchange relations between the two from the 1st century BCE onwards. Of course, the archaeological record is limited in what it is likely to reveal about the totality of cultural characteristics. And this brings us to the case of Pekche. And I'll begin this brief discussion of Pekche's claimed and possible connections with Puyo by stating that I don't believe that a reasonable case can be made for a Pekche state taking shape before the late 3rd century. This is aligned with what I think to be the majority view of archaeologists in Korea, though there are others who would dispute it. I'll also point out the obvious fact that, unlike the Koguryo case, a significant geographic distance complicates the matter of Paekche's claim of extraction from Puyo royalty, which would require a long-distance migration on a small or large scale. Further, I reject the notion that Paekche originated in the Liaoxi region, as a close analysis of this problem shows clearly that the principals involved were Puyo refugees rather than people of an early Paekche, and the timing does not allow for Puyo refugees in Liaoxi to migrate again to the Han River Basin to form the Paekche state. With these basic premises in place, I'll discuss and assess both the foundation myth of Paekche as well as the broader possibility of actual Puyo involvement in the foundation of the Paekche state. Now, as with the case of Koguryo, we can explore the possible links between Paekche and Puyo in at least two ways. The first is to look at the claims put forth in the foundation myth, and the second is to examine material culture for possible Puyo remains in the Paekche geographic sphere. There are at least three general forms of the foundation myth, and all of them have major differences. Most of them, like those of Koguryo, suggest that the Paekche ruling class were descended from refugees from Puyo, and most forms of the myth specifically link the Paekche foundation with that of Koguryo. The form of the myth that can be dated without doubt to a time that Paekche still existed is the one found in Chinese dynastic histories such as the Zhoushu and the Suishu, in which the founder is said to have been Gute, who is said to have been a Puyo Biezhong, or separate race, and a descendant of Dongyang, here probably indicating the Puyo founder. He's also said to have established the Paekche state in the lands south of Daifang Commandery, and he's said to have married the daughter of Gongsun Du, which, if correct, would date the foundation to the late 2nd or early 3rd century. Now, this Gute was probably the same figure who is called Ute in the version of the myth in which Piryu is said to have been the founder of Paekche. The version of the myth that is typically accepted and that you hear most prominently today is the one that has Onjo as the founder, and this ties the Paekche foundation more specifically to that of Koguryo. The purpose here is not to attempt to analyze the variant forms of the myth, but rather to point out that some of them allow for a more believable date and historical circumstance for the Paekche foundation that may involve derivation from either Puyo or Koguryo. Finally, it's necessary to point out that by the late 4th century, Paekche rulers claimed the surname Puyo, and this is notably after the independent state of Puyo had ceased to exist. And a claim to the surname does not necessarily indicate descent from Puyo forebears, since a surname could be adapted for other reasons. It's possible that refugees from Puyo somehow settled in the region of southern Hwanghae or northern Gyeonggi and established a new state. Since Paekche was the name of one of the many small polities of Mahan in the 3rd century, we could assume that the refugees had settled there and that the state grew out of that minor polity. If the migration scenario is correct, it would most likely have occurred between the late 2nd and the early 4th centuries, but archaeological evidence for this is very scant. Several hypotheses for migration from either Puyo or Koguryo have been proposed, but none has been especially convincing, often because of timing problems or a lack of material evidence. Further, as I've suggested in the case of Koguryo, it's entirely possible that Paekche leaders had every reason to create a completely fictional narrative of derivation from Puyo, since doing so would give them a kind of political legitimacy that would have been recognized broadly across Northeast Asia. The material record of the region centered on the lower Han River Basin does reveal some interesting information. While the mortuary record of this region mostly shows continuity from much earlier times, by the 4th century we find in Seokcheongdong in Seoul a number of stone tombs that look very much like the elite tombs of contemporary Koguryo found at the latter's capital city on the Yalu River. The tombs of Seokcheongdong are understood as those of Paekche kings and elites of the late 4th century, and if they are actually Koguryo tombs, this would suggest a strong cultural connection with Koguryo rather than with Puyo. A real connection with Koguryo would explain why Paekche rulers could also claim ultimate origins in Puyo by linking with the Koguryo foundation myth. However, though the exteriors of the Seokcheongdong tombs closely resemble those of Goguryeo, their interior structures show significant differences. This suggests that Paekche elites were aware of the exterior appearance of Goguryeo elite tombs and sought to imitate them, which in turn prompts the questions of how were they familiar with tombs found on the Yalu River, and whether they really had migrated from the north. Other aspects of formative Paekche, such as the construction of walled towns, do not clearly suggest that they were modeled after those of Puyo or Goguryeo. However, in recent years, a number of artifacts excavated in South Korea have been either identified or as interpreted as products of Puyo. A tomb at Unyangdong in Kimpo yielded a pair of gold earrings and some iron swords and spearheads that have been interpreted as manufactures of Puyo. Although a nearly identical earring was found in the Puyo cemetery of Laohaeshun, they've also been found in Goguryeo contexts on the Yalu River. There have also been claims of Puyo-style ornaments found at the Pungnap-Tosang walled site in Seoul, which, if confirmed, might further provide evidence of some links with Puyo, though the possibility of indirect exchange via Goguryeo could also be considered. Outside of the Han River Basin, some gilt bronze horse trappings were excavated from a tomb in the Daesongdong Cemetery in Kimhae and were associated with others that were found in the Lamadong Cemetery in western Liaoning, which may have been a cemetery for Puyo captives who were buried there in the early 4th century. Although the sword that was excavated from the Osong site in Cheongju is almost certainly a product of Puyo, its context is quite late, and it's unclear as to how the sword came to be in this location. And this is a matter to be addressed in another talk in this symposium. Now, these are all isolated finds involving apparently Puyo products in an indigenous context, and it's difficult to interpret them directly as evidence of Puyo migration rather than the result of exchange. To summarize, Paekche claims of descent from Puyo elites may very well have been fictions created for political purposes, but we cannot readily exclude the possibility of actual migrations. Such migrations, if they existed, might not leave many traces in the material record, especially if they were small in scale. A number of isolated finds of artifacts in southern Korea that appear to be products of Puyo strongly suggest that there were at least indirect exchange relations that linked Puyo and Paekche, or Paekche's pre-state antecedents. Paekche elites were certainly familiar with Puyo as they adopted the Puyo surname, and they seem to have been aware of at least the external appearance of Goguryeo elite tombs of the 4th century. This is suggestive of certain shared cultural characteristics that linked these polities over time, but such commonalities need not be explained by group migration. The nature of connections between Puyo and Paekche are important to understand, and we will require more data from the material record before we can gain a clearer understanding of the matter. And I'll close with a few words on directions for future research. Now, as I've noted repeatedly, I don't think we need to limit ourselves to understanding the foundation myths of Puyo, Goguryeo, and Paekche as having any kind of historical basis. Instead, we should seek to understand why such claims of derivation and succession might have been created and cast in mythical terms. The material record for the regions in which Goguryeo and Paekche formed tell us much about how these polities came to be, and I believe that more comprehensive analyses of the totality of the record for the Shinbin-Hwanren region as well as for the Hwanghae-Gyeonggi region will permit us to gain a better understanding of the social and political forces that gave rise to Goguryeo and Paekche as states. Puyo's role, if any, in these processes may or may not be discernible in that record, but the matter can and should be explored. More generally, a better understanding of Puyo material culture now enables us to identify it outside of the Puyo context. And through this effort, we might better identify trade or other exchange networks in which Puyo was involved. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.